The Great Assembly Hall on planet Nexus Prime was the largest building ever constructed by any species in the known galaxy, and it hummed with the voices of 1,000 different alien races who had gathered for the most important meeting in 300 years. Admiral Grace Cooper stood at the back of the human delegation and watched the chaos unfold before her eyes, and she could not help but feel that something was very wrong. At the center of the massive chamber floated an ancient being that no one had ever seen before, and it was called simply the Elder because nobody knew its real name or where it came from or how old it truly was. The Elder had arrived 6 months ago in a ship that seemed older than most stars, and it had requested to speak to all the civilizations of the galaxy, and everyone had agreed because the curiosity was too great to ignore. But now, after 3 days of listening to the Elder speak, not a single species in the entire assembly could understand what it was trying to say. The being was beautiful in a strange and terrifying way, and its body shifted between solid and liquid and light and crystal all at once, and tendrils of glowing energy extended from its core and pulsed in patterns that seemed to mean something important. The universal translators that normally worked on every known language had failed completely, and the greatest minds from dozens of worlds had tried every method of communication they knew. Ambassador Zix of the Valorian Collective slammed his appendage against his console in frustration and shouted that this was a waste of time and that the Elder was clearly insane. Minister Keth of the Dracovian Empire agreed, and his scaled body rippled with anger as he demanded that the assembly move on to more important matters, like the trade disputes that were threatening to start another war. Grace watched the Elder continue its strange transmission, and she felt something tugging at her heart that she could not explain. And it was like watching someone try desperately to say something while slowly forgetting how to speak. Her aide, Danny Marsh, appeared beside her, and he was young with freckles across his face, and he looked worried as he reported that every translation attempt had failed. The Valorians tried 17 different methods, Danny said, and the Cricks used pheromone interpretation, and the monoliths attempted quantum communication, and nothing worked at all. Grace nodded slowly, and she noticed that the Elder seemed to be growing more agitated, and its patterns were becoming faster and more erratic, as if it knew that time was running out. "There is someone you should meet," Danny said quietly, and Grace turned to look at him. "His name is Ben Porter," Danny continued, "and he is a linguist from Earth who specializes in dead languages and nonverbal communication, and he has been watching the Elder for 6 hours straight without moving." Grace raised an eyebrow and asked where this man was now, and Danny pointed toward the observation gallery above them. "Bring him here," Grace ordered. Ben Porter arrived looking like he had not slept in days, and his brown hair was messy, and his shirt was buttoned wrong, but his eyes were bright with something that looked like understanding. "Admiral Cooper," he said, barely pausing to acknowledge her rank before turning back to stare at the Elder and saying that he needed to get closer. Grace asked why, and Ben struggled to find the words, and then he said something that changed everything. "I think the Elder is not speaking in words or mathematics or any structured language at all," Ben said, and his voice was filled with wonder and sadness all at once. "Then what is it speaking?" Grace asked. Ben finally looked at her, and there were tears forming in his eyes as he answered, "I think it is speaking in grief." The word hung in the air between them, and Grace felt a chill run down her spine, because suddenly the Elder's strange patterns made a terrible kind of sense. "When I was 12 years old, my grandmother died," Ben continued, "and she had a disease that made her forget everything, and at the end, she could not remember my name or her own children." He paused and swallowed hard before continuing. "But sometimes she would try to tell us something important, and she could not find the words anymore. So she would just make sounds, and the doctor said it was meaningless, but it was not meaningless." Admiral Grace remembered her own father dying the same way and reaching for words that no longer existed in his broken mind, and she understood exactly what Ben was describing. She was trying to tell us she loved us, Ben said, and she was trying to say goodbye, and that is what the elder is doing. Right now, the assembly speaker, a tall glowing being named Luminous, announced that the session would be ending soon if no progress was made, and the elder's patterns became even more frantic. "Can you talk to it?" Grace asked Ben. "How do you talk to grief?" Ben replied. "And how do you answer sorrow that has lasted for 1,000,000,000 years?" Grace looked at the young linguist and then at the ancient being floating in its containment field, and she made a decision. "You are human," she said, "and we have been talking to grief since we first looked up at the stars and wondered why everything we love has to die." Ben stared at her for a long moment, and then something changed in his face, and he straightened his shoulders and wiped his eyes and asked Grace to get him closer to the elder. She did not know if this would work, but she knew that they had to try because the alternative was letting something precious slip away into silence. Forever, Grace called in every favor she had ever earned in 30 years of military service, and within minutes, Ben was standing on an observation platform directly in front of the elder. The entire assembly fell silent, and every alien in the chamber turned to watch the small human standing before the ancient being. Ben took a deep breath, and then he did something that no one expected. He began to hum a simple melody that a mother might sing to a child, and the elder stopped. No one understood the elder alien diplomat until a human spoke and stunned everyone. Silence in the assembly hall was absolute, and not a single being moved or spoke. As they watched the impossible scene unfolding before them, Ben Porter stood on the observation platform, humming a simple tune, and the elder had frozen completely for the first time in 3 days. The ancient being's tendrils of light hung motionless in the air, and its crystalline body had stopped shifting between states, and it seemed to be listening with every part of its strange form. Then slowly and impossibly the elder began to hum back. The sound was not something most species could hear, because it existed in a frequency beyond normal perception, but every human in the assembly hall heard it clearly. Admiral Grace Cooper felt tears streaming down her face, and she could not have stopped them even if she wanted to, because the sound was the loneliest thing she had ever experienced. It was the sound of watching everyone you love turn to dust, and it was the sound of remembering names that nobody else remembered anymore, and it was the sound of carrying a message across the emptiness between galaxies while hoping that someone somewhere would finally understand. Ben's humming changed and shifted to match the elder's tone, and then he began to sing. The words were from an ancient Earth language that had survived for 3,000 years, and it was a funeral song for warriors who had fallen in battle, but the translation did not matter because the meaning went beyond any language. "We remember," Ben sang, with his voice cracking from emotion, "and we remember." Youth elder shuddered, and its form began to change and solidify into something that was almost recognizable. And then a projection emerged from its core. It was a map of stars, but not just any map. This was a record of civilizations, and there were hundreds of them, and thousands and millions. And they were all the species that had risen and fallen while the elder watched over the long ages of the universe. Danny Marsh grabbed Grace's arm, and his voice was shaking as he whispered that he understood now. The elder had been keeping their memories alive, Danny said, and it was the last one left from whatever species it had belonged to, and it had been carrying all these dead civilizations inside itself for longer than any of them could imagine. The projection shifted and showed the final days of each civilization, but it did not show their wars or their conquests. Instead, it showed their moments of connection, a mother holding her child as their son exploded around them, and two friends embracing during the final hours of their world, and lovers watching the last sunset on a planet that would soon be nothing but dust. And through all of these images, there was a heartbeat. Grace could hear it now, and it was faint and growing fainter with each passing moment, and she realized with horror that it was the elder's own heartbeat. The ancient being was dying, It had traveled across the entire universe to find anyone who could understand what it carried, and had not come to save itself, because that was beyond hope. Now it had come to pass on the memories. It had come to make sure that the billions of lives it had witnessed would not be forgotten when it finally faded away. And out of all the species in the assembly hall, with all their advanced technology and ancient wisdom, only the humans had heard its cry. Grace looked around and saw that she was not the only one crying, and the Valorian ambassador had tears flowing from his sensory tendrils, and even the stone-faced monoliths were vibrating with something that might have been emotion-wise. She heard someone ask, and she turned to see that it was Minister Keth of the Dracovians, who had been so dismissive just hours before. "Because we are young," Grace answered, and her voice was steady even though her heart was breaking. "I do not understand," Keth said. "Humanity has only been among the stars for 80 years, Grace explained, "and before that we spent thousands of years on a single planet dying and losing people. We loved and burying our dead and telling stories about them so they would not be forgotten." She gestured to the Elder's projection where another civilization was playing out its final moments. "Every species here has found ways to extend life and conquer death and go beyond the limits of biology," Grace continued, "and you have all forgotten what it means to grieve and what it means to carry the memory of someone who is gone forever. But humans have not forgotten," Keth asked. "We could not forget even if we wanted to," Grace said, "and it is part of everything we are, and our stories, and our songs, and our art all come from knowing that we will lose everyone we love someday." She looked at Ben, who was still singing to the Elder with everything he had. "That is why Ben can understand," the Elder, Grace said, "because he has spent his whole life learning to speak the language of loss." The projection continued, showing civilization after civilization and a billion years of memory compressed into moments of devastating beauty. A warrior dying to protect their children, and a scientist finishing his work with his last breath, and two strangers sharing a meal as their world ended around them. And through it all, the Elder's heartbeat grew weaker, but the connection between Ben and the ancient being grew stronger, and Grace could see that something was being transferred and something precious was passing from one soul to another. The problem was that Ben was only one person, and the Elder had been carrying memories for longer than the human species had existed. This burden was too heavy for anyone to bear alone. No one understood the Elder alien Diplomat until a human spoke and stunned everyone. Ben collapsed 3 hours into the communication, and Grace caught him before he hit the ground. The young linguist was pale and shaking, and his pulse was weak, and his eyes could not focus on anything around him. "I cannot hold it all," Ben gasped, "and there is too much, and the memories are crushing me." The Elder's projection flickered, and its patterns became chaotic again, and for the first time since the connection had started, it looked like the ancient being was panicking. Danny rushed forward and reached for Ben's arm, saying they needed to get him to the medical bay immediately. No, Ben grabbed Grace's uniform with surprising strength, and his eyes found hers. "Despite his exhaustion, if we break the connection, now everything will be lost," Ben said, "and all those memories and all those people will die with the Elder, and everything it sacrificed to bring them here will mean nothing. You are killing yourself," Grace said, "and I cannot let you do that." "Then find me help," Ben replied, and his voice was desperate but determined, and behind his exhaustion, Grace could see an iron will that refused to give up. "Find me other humans who can share this burden," Ben continued, "because I cannot be the only one who understands grief, and I cannot be the only one who has lost someone they loved." Grace looked around the assembly hall, and the human delegation was small, with only 50 people, and most of them were military or diplomatic staff, but scattered throughout the galleries she could see others. There were civilian consultants and journalists and scientists who had come to observe the historic assembly, and they were all human, and they had all lost someone at some point in their lives. Grace grabbed the nearest communication panel and opened an unrestricted channel to every human in the building. This "Is Admiral Grace Cooper," she announced, and her voice echoed through the massive chamber. "We have a situation that requires immediate help, and I'm asking every human present to listen carefully. If you have ever lost someone you loved, and if you have ever carried grief that seemed too heavy to bear alone, then we need you right now. Please come to the observation platform immediately." The response was faster than she had dared to hope. They came from every corner of the assembly hall, and they were ordinary people who had lived ordinary lives filled with extraordinary pain. A journalist named Kyle Martinez arrived first, and his face was wet with tears as he explained that he had lost his husband in a colony ship accident 5 years ago, and he still talked to him every night before he went to sleep. A scientist named Paula Burke came next, and she was older, with gray in her hair, and she told Grace that her daughter had died of a childhood illness that should have been cured centuries ago. But the medicine had arrived 1 week too late. A soldier named Anthony Hayes pushed through the crowd, and his hands were shaking as he confessed that he still woke up screaming the names of the friends he had failed to save in a battle that had ended 10 years ago. More and more humans gathered on the platform, and they placed their hands on Ben's shoulders, and they added their voices to his song, and as they did, something extraordinary happened. The elder's projection expanded and grew brighter and stronger than it had been before. No longer was it showing only its own memories, because now human memories were flowing into the mix. Kyle's husband appeared laughing at a joke that was not funny, while Kyle watched him with so much love that it hurt to see Paula's daughter took her first steps, and her little face was filled with determination and pride. Anthony's soldiers shared a meal together the night before the battle that would take them away forever, and they were young and scared and alive. The memories merged and blended and became something greater than either species could have created alone. Grace watched in amazement as the projection showed human grief mixing with alien grief. And they were not the same, but they were similar enough to understand each other. The elder's heartbeat grew stronger. The ancient being seemed to draw energy from the connection, and its form stabilized, and the panic faded from its pattern's ambassador. Zix of the Valorians approached Grace, and his voice was filled with wonder as he asked how the humans were doing this. "We are not doing anything special," Grace replied, "and we are just remembering. But we have perfect memory storage," Zix said, "and we can preserve every detail of every moment forever." And yet we could not connect with the elder at all. Grace shook her head and tried to explain something that seemed obvious to her, but apparently was not obvious to beings who had conquered death. Preserving memories is not the same as carrying them, Grace said, "and you store information like data in a computer. But we carry our losses like wounds in our hearts." She watched as more humans joined the circle around Ben, and their combined voices rose in a chorus of grief and love and remembrance. "That is the difference," Grace continued, "and our memories hurt us, and they change us, and they become part of who we are forever." The elder's projection responded to her words, and it showed images of its own species from billions of years ago. And they had looked different then, and smaller and more fragile. They had known grief too once upon a time, and they had carried their dead in their hearts just like humans did now. But somewhere along the way, as they grew more powerful and more advanced, they had forgotten how to feel loss, and they had learned to preserve without carrying, and to remember without grieving. And when their entire species had died, the elder had been left alone with memories that it no longer knew how to process until a young human linguist had heard its pain and answered with a song. The communication continued. For hours, and more humans arrived, and the circle grew larger, and the connection grew stronger. By the end of the day, there were over 200 humans on the platform, and they were all crying and singing and sharing their grief with an ancient being who had waited 1 billion years to be understood. And somewhere in the middle of it all, something changed. The elder stopped just transmitting memories. It started getting something back. No one understood the elder alien diplomat until a human spoke and stunned everyone. The communication lasted for 17 hours, and by the observation platform was crowded with over 200 humans whose voices had joined together. In a chorus that went beyond words, they sang songs from every culture in human history, and there were hymns and sea songs and lullabies and war chants and wedding melodies and funeral music from 100 different traditions. They wept and laughed and held each other as the elder poured its billion years of memory into their willing hearts. Grace stood at the edge of the platform, watching something she knew she would never be able to fully describe, and the elder's form had changed during the long hours of connection. It was more solid now and more defined, as if the act of being understood had given it new strength. But Grace could also see the truth that Ben had recognized from the very beginning. The elder was still dying. Nothing could change that, because it had simply lived too long and carried too much and traveled too far, and its body was shutting down system by system and light by light. But it was no longer afraid as the 17th hour came to an end. The elder's projection shifted one final time, and instead of memories, it now showed a single image. It was a seedling pushing its way through soil that was covered in ash. Danny moved closer to Grace and asked what that image meant. Ben, who was somehow still conscious after all those hours, smiled through his exhaustion and said that it was a gift. The elder is giving us something, Ben explained. The seedling in the projection grew, and its branches spread outward and became stars, and its roots extended downward and became worlds, and on each of those worlds, Grace could see the civilizations that the elder had carried for so long. But they were not dead anymore. They were reborn and changed and different from what they had been. But they were alive in a way that mattered there. Knowledge and their love had been woven into the fabric of a universe that would remember them forever. The elder is giving us the memories, Grace realized, and not just to carry, but to use and to grow from. She looked more closely at the projection and saw that there was more than just images. There were technical specifications hidden in the patterns, and there were solutions to problems that humanity had struggled with for centuries. She could see medical information that could cure diseases that had been thought incurable, and energy systems that could power entire worlds without destroying them, and travel methods that could cross the galaxy in days instead of years. This was the knowledge of 1 billion dead civilizations, and it had been preserved in the memory of a single ancient being for longer than the stars had burned, and now it was being offered freely to a species that had just learned to speak the language of grief. Kyle Martinez stepped forward, and his face was still wet with tears as he asked why the elder had chosen humans. Wise, Kyle said, and we are the youngest species here, and we have only been in space for 80 years, and there are civilizations in this room that have existed for millions of years. The elder's final pulse answered his question, and it did not use images or sounds. It used pure emotion. Grace felt it wash over her, and it was warm and sad and grateful all at once, and she understood the message perfectly, because you remembered how to grieve, because you never learned to forget, because in all the universe you are the only species young enough to still believe that love matters more than time. The elder's light began to fade, and Grace felt her heart breaking as she watched the ancient being slip away. But Ben stepped forward and raised his hand toward the containment field, and his voice was gentle as he spoke. "We'll remember you," he promised, "and we will remember all of them, and your journey was not wasted, and your burden will not be forgotten." The elder pulsed one more time, and it was weaker than before, but there was something in that pulse that felt like peace. Then it went dark. The assembly hall was silent, and every species stood frozen as they processed what they had witnessed. Ambassador Zix was the first to speak, and his voice was hushed with awe as he said that in 600 cycles of the assembly, nothing like this had ever happened before. Minister Keth of the Dracovians nodded slowly, and his earlier hostility was completely gone. "The humans have done what none of us could," Keth admitted, "and they have bridged a gap that we did not even know existed. Grace looked at the other alien delegates and saw that something had changed in how they looked at the human delegation. There was respect now and curiosity, and perhaps even a little envy. The assembly speaker Luminos glided forward, and his bioluminescent form was pulsing with emotion as he made an announcement. The Galactic Assembly formally recognizes humanity as a full-member species, Luminos declared, and this is decided by unanimous vote. Grace heard gasps from her own delegation because full membership usually took centuries to achieve, and humanity had been expecting to remain observers for at least another 100 years. But that was not all. Luminos continued speaking and said that the Assembly also requested human assistance with a matter of great importance. We have forgotten how to grieve, Luminos admitted, and we have lost the ability to carry our memories in our hearts, and we ask humanity to teach us how to feel again. Grace looked at the 200 humans who had shared the Elder's burden, and they were exhausted and emotionally drained, but there was pride in their eyes. They had come to the Assembly as observers from a young and insignificant species. They were leaving as teachers to the oldest civilizations in the universe. No one understood the elder alien diplomat until a human spoke and stunned everyone. They buried the elder in the heart of a star. It had been the ancient being's final request, and Grace had made sure that the wish was honored exactly as it had been communicated. The elder's body would become part of the nuclear fire, and its atoms would join the dance of fusion that had powered the universe since the beginning of time. In 1 billion years, those atoms would scatter across space and become part of new worlds and new life and new civilizations that would never know the lonely traveler who had carried so much for so long, but they would carry the memories. Grace stood on the bridge of the human ship Constellation and watched the burial through special view screens that had been designed to handle the radiation of a star. Ben was beside her, and he was leaning against the console because he was still recovering from the 17 hours of communication that had nearly killed him. Danny approached with his tablet and reported that the aftermath of the Assembly was already changing the galaxy. The Valorians have requested human counselors for their grief processing programs, Danny said, and they want to learn how to carry memories instead of just storing them. The Crick Swarm wants our help recovering cultural traditions that they thought were lost forever, Danny continued, and they have realized that preserving data is not the same as keeping something alive. Even the Dracovians have asked for assistance, Danny added with surprise in his voice, and Minister Kath personally requested human advisors to help them honor their war dead in a more meaningful way. Grace nodded slowly and took in the magnitude of what had happened and the Elder's gift. She asked. Danny's face lit up with excitement as he explained that the science teams were already working on the knowledge that had been transferred during the communication. The medical advances alone could extend human lifespan by centuries, Danny said, and there are cures for diseases that we thought were impossible to treat. The energy technology could power entire planets without pollution, Danny continued, and the propulsion systems could open up the entire galaxy for exploration. Grace listened to his report, but she was thinking about something else entirely. That is not the real gift, she said quietly. Danny looked confused and asked what she meant. Grace turned to face the other humans who had gathered on the bridge, and they were the 200 people who had shared the Elder's burden and carried its grief and helped it find peace at the end of its long journey. The real gift is not the technology, Grace explained, and it is not even the medical advances or the faster ships. The real gift is the understanding that memory matters and that love endures, and that the briefest life, when properly remembered, can echo across eternity. She looked at Ben, who had started everything with a simple melody, and he was smiling despite his exhaustion. We came to this assembly as the youngest species in the galaxy, Grace continued, and we were observers who nobody expected to contribute anything meaningful, but we did contribute something, and it was something that no other species could offer. Paula Burke stepped forward, and her eyes were red from crying, but her voice was strong. We showed them that grief is not a weakness, she said. And we showed them that carrying pain can make you stronger, Anthony Hayes nodded. And added that they had proven that remembering the dead is not a burden but an honor. Kyle Martinez spoke last, and his voice was gentle, as he said that they had taught the universe that love does not end when someone dies. Grace felt pride swelling in her chest as she looked at these ordinary humans who had done something extraordinary. We are not just going to use the Elders' technology to build better ships and cure diseases, Grace announced, and we are going to do something far more important. We are going to help the universe remember how to grieve, and in doing so we will remind everyone why life is worth living in the first place. The constellation turned away from the burial star, and its engines hummed with power that had been designed by civilizations dead for 1 billion years around. The human ship vessels from a dozen different species fell into formation, and their crews watched. The small human vessel was something they had not felt in a very long time. They felt hope, because somewhere in the vast emptiness between stars, a young species had heard an ancient being crying out in loneliness and despair, and instead of ignoring the cry or trying to analyze it, or giving up when it seemed impossible to understand, the humans had simply answered with a song. They had offered comfort to something that had been alone for longer than their species had existed. They had shared their own grief so that another being would not have to carry its burden alone, and in doing so they had changed everything. The galaxy would never be the same because humanity had proven that the most advanced technology and the oldest wisdom could not match the simple power of a heart that remembered how to feel. Ben looked out at the stars stretching endlessly before them, and he thought about his grandmother who had started him on this path so many years ago. She had taught him that love could survive even when words failed, and that connection could exist even when communication seemed impossible. She had been right, and now the whole universe knew it too. Grace gave the order to head home, and the constellation jumped to faster than light speed and disappeared into the endless night. But the memory of what had happened on Nexus Prime would last forever, because that is what humans do. They remember